Hi, and welcome to Elassomorph Studio Session 12. Welcome. Now, we are doing a mix of things today. Let's go over to the classroom. There we are. We're doing a mix of things today just to get our paintings all level with each other. Here is the big Elassomorph, the central one. Up at the top here, above the flag, we have the suggestion, if you see it, the suggestion of foliage. So, it's a thing. We have to include it now. It's part of the process. So what I've got is some olive paint, straight out of the tube, mixed with a lot of fast medium fixer because I don't expect we're going to be using this a lot. We're not going to be revisiting this a lot. So there we are, fast medium fixer, and this is being basically introduced to the area above the flag. Okay. Now, I'm doing a kind of circular motion here, and the paint is thinning out as I'm doing this, so I'm getting a sort of gradation, even though I rotated the brush a little bit there. There's a gradation. Let's bring it into the foliage there and here, and now it looks as if it's fading off into the distance. Inside the shape created by this leaf form here. Deliberately doing a sort of circular motion to give the impression of foliage, trees, a cluster of trees. I'm using a flat brush for this, and I'm lifting out to the point of becoming dry brush here, where I've run out of paint, and I'm borrowing from the previous space. There we go. Borrowing from there, and making it spread out a lot further, suggesting foliage, some large trees in the distance. Okay, and that will be the foil to the sky. But I've got a space here where these flowers are, where the flowers are light and the background is light, and so the contrast is lost. So this is the ideal opportunity to bring in some foliage forms here. And make them show the flowers in relief. So again, that kind of circular motion, and also attempting to let the brush dry out. There we go. More circular motion, and if I go up here and create a kind of halo, around the guitar. That's fine. There is no great plan here, just the idea that some areas may need contrast more than others. And so having done that, I feel the space between the headstock of the guitar and the fingerboard of the guitar also needs some contrast. And so the foliage of these trees is being made to transition down to about here, which is about the third mark on the horizontal of the picture. So the top third, middle third, bottom third. Okay, which is roughly a compositional device that we have for making things pleasing to look at. There we go. So this ivory flat brush, again from Rosemary & Co. Let's have a look. It's a 0 Rosemary & Co. Ivory Short Flat. And I'm using it to scrub in the details that I need for the foliage and to create contrast between the light shapes of the flowers here and these flowers here. So we can almost imagine that there's a ground line. There's some ground round about here that the foliage is rooted in. Now I'm noticing, because this is including some fast drying medium, is it fast drying? Yep. There's a kind of gloss to it that is absent from the rest of the painting, which is used water or thinner and gives a kind of matte look. So I'm wondering if that is picking up on the screen. There's a kind of shine to it. So let's include some foliage between here, the right side of the flag, and the inside of the plant material, which is growing up from the base around the right hand side of the painting. So I do like this olive by Winsor and Newton. It's quite a natural colour and actually formed the basis of many a hummingbird that I have painted. Okay, that's fine. The problem is the separation between the olive of the foliage and the sky that is there. So what we need is cerulean blue hue, colours that we've used before, and some white. Here's the cerulean. Just, I'm guessing, a very small amount because it's a fairly strong pigment. Although it's not a true pigment, as we've mentioned before, it's a hue. So it's a copy that I've tried to make cheap for the student market, and we're using titanium white, although titanium white is a very strong colour as well, and the mixing white, true mixing white, is zinc white. Okay, so what I'm going to try and do is loosen these up with water, not worrying about cleaning out the brush too much because I wanted to dull this blue and white down. I wanted to grey it a little, and I was thinking of introducing a little bit of burnt umber into it. So the burnt umber would have dulled down the blue. But the olive I'm noticing is doing a similar job, so it's having a kind of dulling effect on the blue. And there's quite a lot of white to the blue composition. So let's try a touch. Yep, that's okay. So I'm going to go back in with a small amount of the fast drying medium. I was reading the literature lately and discovered, to my surprise, that depending on the pigment, you can expect to wait up to 10 days for a pigment to dry. So I'm not overly keen on that notion. So I noticed that the reverse side of the brush had too much blue, so I've introduced slightly more titanium white, and I'm blending on the surface. A fairly dry blending would be called scumbling, where some of the color of the the color underneath would show through. But here I'm using the blue to delineate where the crowns of the tree forms end. So I'm using this blue, and with the titanium white it's become fairly opaque. I'm using it to mask out where the sky is and where the trees aren't. And if I can do the same here, where the flower forms are, I may correct my drawing a little and come down into the foliage a little bit more naturally. Okay, that's fine. So we've got a little bit of sky coming in there. And just to remind ourselves, we used titanium white and cerulean blue hue. I want it a little bit lighter in places, so I'm dabbing in a little bit of titanium white, and I'm going to mix that in a little bit with some circular motions. I'm doing a little kind of circular motion with the brush. I'm hoping that you can pick that up on the screen, just to lighten it up a little. But I know that those colours are going to sink in a little bit because our lights darken and our dark colours tend to dry lighter. It's just a thing. Compositionally, I think I want a little bit of more of a dip here. So that's a little bit more interesting there. Apologies. Okay, there's a little break in the tree line, and you can see how the olive kind of knocks back the blue, neutralizes it somewhat. That's fine. I'm fairly happy with that. So I've got a skyline, I've got a tree line, I've got a kind of ground or grass line, which matches at the top third. So at the third mark with 2/3 separation, which is going to work for me. So that's okay. I'm quite happy with that. Now the sky colour with a little bit more cerulean blue, a little bit bluer than the sky, can be used to knock back this blue. It's such a harsh blue for the water. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a slightly bluer mix of the sky colour and introduce it into the waterfall area. But I don't want to lose all of my French ultramarine blue. So if you've been following this series, you'll know all the colours that have been used so far. I don't want to use too much, like completely obliterate that blue, but it does need to be knocked back somewhat. And then out of the picture plane. Okay, so less of the harsh blue. However, the sense of motion, movement in that waterfall has been lost a little bit. So what I want to do is bring it in a little bit by using a little bit of SCruffito technique to drag out some of the material and let some of the undercolour show through. And failing that, since this is the fast drying medium, we can go back into that with the darker of the two blues. But actually, I'm quite happy with that. And also where the white transitions in. So for me, at the moment, there is enough of a balance there. I'm fairly happy with that. Okay, now I'm going to switch over to this here. This painting here also requires it. It's just far too blue. This is the smaller of my flats, and I'm going to try and get close to these areas here, the outline, if you can see that, the area that I'm working on is close to where this pallet is floating on the river that's coming down from these mountains in the distance. So we have to knock back that blue a little in the similar manner to this dark blue here that we had. So what I'm going to do is lean in to the image a little bit. Hopefully you can see. Hopefully you can see if I turn it that way, maybe a little bit. So we can bring in this blue. That's a little bit better. However, I do like these riggers for fine detail, and so I'm going to create some movement on the water. So the brush is actually quite dry. In other words, the paint could be a little bit more fluid than it is, but I'm enjoying kind of scumbling in these blue areas, light blue areas. But I do have a problem of where the blue meets the outline of things like the pallet and the beak of this bird here. Okay, so a little bit more fast drying, a little bit more water. Okay, and let's see how well we do with our drawing. Okay, it wants to draw. And what I want to do is, since my original drawing was in French ultramarine blue, I want to try and reduce that thickness of line. Now I do have to ask myself why it is that I like to draw in blue sometimes. One of my art heroes, a portrait artist, largely a portrait artist, Alice Neal, used to do that with her works. And well, perhaps somehow I have been influenced by what I've seen in her work, and because I admire her, maybe that's the reason why I chose to draw the shape. Using French ultramarine, which is a fairly strong blue. And again, I want to get quite close to eradicating the where that drying medium is very quick. So I'm introducing a little bit more water into the mix, although you can't see that off screen. So what I want to do is try and soften this blue somewhat. But I don't want to eradicate the French ultramarine completely, but I do want to correct earlier drawing mistakes. And the really mistakes are the mistakes. Earlier drawing attempts, for want of a better expression. Okay. And the colour that is resulting from the mixing is actually slightly more pleasing and is more in keeping with the general feel of the painting. So I have to say that since tackling that blue area, there is more harmony in the painting overall. Small detail, can we see it? Hopefully you can see the detail being added just above the beak towards the land line and around the palette form. Over the course of painting these Elassomorphs, I've become more confident in my brush handling, to the extent that I don't feel quite so cagey as I did before, and that includes being aware that there is an online audience. So now that this blue has been introduced, this seems a little bit too dark. So if I can go in with even more white, more fast drying. Let's see if we can knock this back a tone or tint. More water is needed. To help it flow. Okay, so here we go. Well, it's definitely a lighter mix, and it's flowing like the way I like my paint to flow. Because of the white in the mix, the titanium white, it does have a kind of chalkiness to it. but I know that because of the dilution, there's going to be some sinkage, and so that when it dries, it's going to dry quite a bit darker than the light that I'm putting on. But I only wanted to nudge it about 1 or 2 tints anyway. I didn't want a big change in it, a big significant change in it. And I just wanted the drawing to be more clear. So, with a bit of luck, that looks more distant, that looks a little bit closer, and the water is flowing a little bit more, and the colour of the river reflects the sky a little bit more honestly. It is more plausible is a word that I use quite a lot, so it's more believable. And in a small painting like this, because it's only 6 inches by 8, irrespective of the detail that I've tried to incorporate into it, the variety of colours needs to work in a painting so small. As much as it would have to in a much larger painting. And so, last moment decision is to make the water palette. The palette is floating on the water. Make the hole that is the thumb hole allow the river to show through, and almost as soon as I've done it, I don't regret it at all. I think that was a good move. Okay, so I feel there's greater balance in this painting now than before. Last of all, with the blue, just some of the highlight in the iris needs a little bit of blue, a little stronger application of blue. There we go. And that is that image. I can't think of any more blue that needs to be added. So of course you can see already the guitar up here, which is the distant hill. And there's some separation occurring. If this was watercolour, I would say there's some bleeding going on. But to me, that's just visually more interesting than the solid block that I had before. Even at a distance. I'm fairly happy with that. And when it dries, it'll dry darker, but like I say, I'm still fairly happy with that. Now the iris in the next Elassomorph is largely untouched, and so now's a really good chance to go in with the cerulean blue titanium white mix and the fast drying medium, and create an iris. Now, I am aware that the painting style that I'm using at the moment is naive, and so it's not out of place to outline, but in terms of, what I want to do with my painting, it would be there, a little highlight, would just be a little highlight. What I'm trying to achieve by being naive is spoilt somewhat. If we outline everything, it resembles a cartoon rather than a painting. And while outlining would not be out of place in a naive painting, it's not a cartoon. So for me, there is a difference. Okay, so that's a very blue eye. So now I feel that I should introduce to my palette the French ultramarine blue. Add a little touch of water, a little touch of the fast drying medium, which can be considered as a kind of glaze medium. Knock that back a little bit with the olive. Just take some of the intensity out of the blue. And find a half step by mixing with our cerulean and white mix. And so I can outline a little bit with the darker mix, the darker French ultramarine blue mix. And for me, in the series of paintings that I've been doing, the studio practice I've been demonstrating, I don't often work wet and wet. I tend to like to glaze my colours a little bit more. Okay. I think I want even darker, so I've found a part that's less mixed. So more of the kind of French ultramarine character. And I can use it on the outside of the iris and also on the outside of the pupil, and that suggests an area in between where these midtones can be used to create the detailing on the iris. Now I need a little bit more pure titanium white up here. So if the highlight on the eyeball is here, we have to assume that the light source is here. But there's things about this painting. One of the key notions in this painting is that there is ubiquitous light. Everything is lit by all light from all directions. And so this kind of is the only concession to this, is that we're imagining a light source which is not ubiquitous, but actually coming from a northwest direction, would cast a highlight here. In a line from the pupil through to the iris, and I'll give that a more kind of solid white highlight, less mixing, and there we go. Introduce a little bit more white there in that direction. Okay, that's fine. If I go back to the other Elassomorph and bring it up to scratch, am I happy with it? I would like a little bit of bluing around the highlight and into the pupil to suggest the greying that must occur there. And once again, back in with the highlight white, so re-establish the highlight, and again my light source, which is not ubiquitous but actually coming from northwest direction, would travel from the highlight through onto the iris about here. Okay, I think I need some highlights here and here. That will be glazed back later, probably off screen. So when I'm not narrating. Okay, this could be more pale, and so I've gone in with a mix of titanium white. Again, working wet on wet. And applying strokes in the direction that the grain of the guitar would experience or expect, and hopefully there'll be less color shift there, so it will die back to a more believable image. For instance, we know that things that are viewed in the distance are viewed through the haze of, dirt and other things which separate the viewer from the object. And so this bluing occurs, and the further the object is away, oh, that's too heavy white. That's too heavy, I'm going to have to mix that out. Objects in the distance have this bluing effect, and so the further distant they are, the more the bluing effect is. So what we're trying to suggest is that this mountain with a cave, which is actually a guitar with a sound hole, is further removed from this mountain here. So this mountain arrangement here is actually further away than this mountain form here. But even having said that, I feel that that needs knocked back a little bit. And if I add a little bit of a little bit of water. I can influence it, but when it dries, it will dry darker. If not, we have another interesting detail to try to make my dream world have more gravitas, more kind of substance. But I think that's going to dry darker. So we'll see. Okay, looking at the eyeball. Try to break up that dark blue a little bit because it seems a little bit strong. Give the illusion that other things are happening on the inside and that the center is much lighter. So working wet on wet there. An area that hasn't made me satisfied is the eyebrow of the bird. So I want that to be as strongly white as it can be. And that's me going in with pure white. And on the pupil, and if I go in with a little bit of blue, the blue mix that I've used already, that will hopefully soften it and make it a little bit more believable. So again, with this one, I believe that the balance is a little bit more correct. Let's go into the big one. Okay, what needs what? Well, we have a waterfall coming down here. And so we would benefit from a white area here. So we decide that the break in the water is here. But then it needs to cascade down and we need to introduce some movement into that. And so I would like to attempt to do that with a fan brush. Again, I'm not sponsored by Rosemary & Co, but this is a Rosemary & Co fan brush and it's from the series 2055. It's a number 1 fan brush and I'm kind of hoping that I can bring down that material into this area here and create a sensation of movement. And if it fails in any measure, I can reverse the brush and scrape into it like this and create some kind of direction, some kind of flow. And so the movement of those lines there, those lines suggest the direction of the flow of water. And this is a technique that I've used on the bird. So I wasn't feeling particularly well yesterday, and so I decided not to live stream. I was having difficulty breathing and only slightly better today. But you can see here that instead of using the end of a brush, what I used was the tip of an embossing tool, and I laid down a mix of titanium white and olive and burnt umber. So the burnt umber and the titanium white should give a very, very warm grey, but I wanted to nudge it ever so slightly green by putting in some of the olive mix that we've used earlier today. And so, yeah, I did. I added that in. So again, in with this mix, then some more of that colour. I'm pressing it in now. And again, going in with these brushes, the fan brush, and create a sensation of movement. That's okay, that's working much, much better this time. But SCruffito is a technique that I love to do, and it's brilliant for these feathers, for the tiny little details in the feathers here on the front of the bird and on the wing, the flight feathers, and on the tail feathers here. And it can actually be done to such extent that you can create a transition, like I'm trying to do now, to demonstrate a transition. So you can go from very light through mids and towards dark. But I still feel that it needs a kind of pure white foaminess here to create splash. Which is best achieved by not mixing in the colours so much. Less mixing. So once you apply it, try not to touch it too much. And I'll just distress that a little bit. Bring in a few marks like that. And that's fine. There is now a waterfall there. I'm in two minds about whether or not to create a rock here, which creates a separation. And so the water would have to flow. So go into my dark, that's dried out already with a fast drying medium. So the water would have to flow around the rock, this side and this side here. And darken some areas. This is just the olive to suggest a little bit of darkening. That's fine. Okay, so I'll set that aside for a while. Except for the fact that I've seen that there are some lighter areas needed to the water here. Just to lighten it up slightly. And dull it down a little bit. Because it was just, the effect was just too strong. Okay. So cerulean blue hue was added to the French ultramarine here, and I'm hoping that the screen can pick it up, but some little highlights have been created on the blue, so you should be able on the screen to see a separation between the dark of the French ultramarine blue and the lighter value of the cerulean blue here. But even with this, I feel that this value should be lightened somewhat more. Okay, so back to this Elassomorph here. I would like to do a little bit more with either the raw umber or the burnt umber, or maybe even a combination as a burnt umber, slightly warmer than the raw. And again the French ultramarine blue. And from our experience, we know that those two browns plus this blue should give a reasonable black. So I'm going to switch over to the rigger and the script liner brush, and there's a small amount of fast drying medium, a tiny amount of stand oil, and a lesser amount of water. So that my synthetic sable brush can move this dark around the black. It's a reasonable black. So what I'd like to do is darken the spaces here where the foliage forms are and make them sing out a little bit more. I'm hoping that in doing so, the flower shapes, or sorry, the leaf shapes can be seen. So they become a little bit more legible, which is another favourite word. There's a separation there between the wing, the edge of the pallet, and the leaf forms. It's a very fine line work there. Okay, so that makes those shapes. By painting the negative space, the positive forms are popping out a little bit more. It's slightly stubborn about moving because of the other media that are in it. So I am fairly heavy-handed with the media, and what I need to learn is that a small amount is needed. So largely, this is a water-based medium. These water mixable oils, so I don't need to have so much medium per water content. But it does handle slightly different, and that's not something that I'm used to. But if you look at the length of that line there, the mix just continues out. That's lovely. Line work is something that I'm very keen on doing. So again, the brush, pressure on the brush can fatten the line or thin it. And when drawing the line, I try to move my hand rather than my fingers. And that steadies the hand a little bit more. So it's not just a matter of dragging the hand along to create a line, but also if you want a thicker line, you just press a little bit downwards towards the surface to flatten that line out and find the contour that you're looking for. But experience is now telling me also that because of added linseed oil, this paint is going to take a little bit longer to dry. And so, having been an acrylic painter for so long, having to be patient and waiting for several days for colours to dry, well, it will give me time to reflect on decisions that I've made and next steps and what I need to learn. It will give me a chance to plan the next steps. But for someone who likes to paint fairly quickly in acrylic, this kind of delay is a little bit frustrating. I've added a little bit more water to help make it flow, especially in a small space. And I'm painting black on black, not as a pointless exercise, but as a way to deepen the colour, but also the medium is adding gloss, and so I would like gloss to be more apparent, not just in the new areas that I've painted, but in the previous areas that I've painted too. I would like that same dark kind of glossiness. Now that has helped to make it pop, that's for sure. It's popping. But ideally, if you're using these paints, a more firm brush would be advantageous. So I have said before that I'm using this kind of sable blend. Let me just check. Yeah, I think it's a sable synthetic blend. So it's a very soft brush. So really, I'm using my oils a bit like watercolor paint. Okay. Rather than, more like watercolor paint rather than thick impasto layers that it's possible to lay on. So that's okay. I've got the sky. I've got a suggestion of foliage. That's had a chance to dry. And so what I'd like to maybe do is go back in with my olive mix and my medium and see if I can create some depth in some of these areas, because they do at the moment appear to be a little bit flat. So what I want to do is try and create some cast shadows It's really just the outermost tops of the crowns that are getting the sunlight, and so that's already somewhat improved. I'll put on the ground at the third. Yep, so that now looks as if there's some light striking the top, which is casting some shadow on a more rounded form. So that's okay. I'm just bringing this third down a little to where the ground might be, but still observing the kind of third mark. It's about the third. So that's okay. Let's look at the next one, see if there's any areas that need addressing with this dark. So what I'm noticing now is because the dark is so dark, it makes the strongest possible contrast with the lighter colours that are going on top. And I was looking at the paintings, the jungle paintings of Henri Rousseau, Rousseau, Rousseau. And yes, that's what he does. He has a very darkened space, and the foliage forms that he puts on top pop out because the dark is so dark. The lights become shown in relief because of the contrast. So looking at this one here, yep, this has begun to dry a little bit lighter, so it looks further off. This one over here is not as strong as it was before, but it appears darker than this one, and therefore it has the appearance of being slightly closer. So these are ideas relating to the notion of aerial perspective. If we look at the big one, yep, we've had a similar idea with the trees. However, I think it's about time to go in, and I've got the medium, so this time it's additional water soluble linseed oil, and so I want these areas here to be a little bit darker, and by doing so this should help define the shape of the mixing palette, the kind of thumb area, and again along here. The brush is beginning to dry out, so if I do a kind of scumbling motion like so, I can create kind of darkened areas below that suggest that the sunlight is hitting the tops of these tree forms. But I'll have to be careful that there's not a halo where the flag is. Okay, so by darkening the shadow under the foliage, in this area here in particular, we can actually read the palette a little bit more clearly as a consequence. So that's okay. Again, over here, this area of foliage is, to me, darker than the areas behind. And so once that foliage is established as dark, the line where the daffodil field is immediately is thrown forward. So that's good. The contrast is welcome. Off screen, my brush is dirty and the water is dirtying, but that isn't always a problem because sometimes the dirtying of the water helps to harmonize all the colors. Not too much, but a little bit is welcome. I'm now putting out some yellow ochre. Okay. And the reason for this is I wish to glaze the guitar. This guitar here and this one. So I want it to be very, very thin. I want a very thin but very oily glaze. And the linseed oil helps me to maintain the fat over lean rule. You can see that just that little application there has done enough to just tint that white. So the white is not quite as abrasive as it was, but also it respects the kind of mark making that I put into the paint when I embossed some grain to suggest the wood. So here, similarly, I'm looking for an almost transparent, almost watercolor kind of glaze. I can do this because the oil and the linseed oil is thinning the paint out, but allowing it to be transparent. So the colours are affected by the colours beneath the underpainting. The colours beneath that we call the underpainting. And if those colours are dark, even if I put some of the glaze over the dark area, you can't see it so much. There's maybe a tiny little shift. But where the white is, if I put some, you can see the very yellow nature of the ochre. Very different from the orangey that we had from this more opaque application here for the branch. Now I've tried to make sure that previous paint layers have dried, so that if I do interfere with their space, it's not spoiling any new area that I'm attempting to paint. So let's see, a little bit more. The linseed oil. Okay. And so yeah, the oil content in the linseed oil is what we call fat. So I'm really pleased with how translucent that oil is. I'm trying to put in slightly darker areas there because sometimes the wood has little kind of scorch marks on it, which is part of, just part of the quality of the spruce or the cedar that is used. However, to lighten that up even more, I am tempted to go in with a tissue or a rag and do some lifting out, because I do want some sheen on the soundboard. So let's just check and see. I have some tissue. And as I said before, there's no edits, it's all raw. So if I do this, there's even some lifting out there, which suggests some of the sheen. Of the guitar, see the material is being lifted out. I'll try some more because I really want a very translucent effect. So I do want it stained, and I was kind of hoping that where the grooves were, where I embossed with the embossing tool, maybe some of the material would sit inside that trough and create a darker space inside a lighter surface. So I'm quite happy with that. Let's try the gold. So the shaded area here. Okay, the glazing has knocked that back a little bit. I'm wondering if I can knock out or lift out the highlights. I put in some white in there deliberately to key in some lights. Okay, so it's dulled it a little bit, and that for me works. I am now feeling tired. I'm getting a little bit distracted. But painting kind of energizes me and makes me very, very happy. Something else that I did before I started live streaming today was I put in a grey on the bits where the dead branch has the bark peeled off. The grey is similar to the grey on the underside of the hummingbird, which was made from burnt umber and titanium white, but there's also small amounts of the yellow and some of the other kind of dirt that collects on the mixing palette was used. And then within the dark olive stippling, I put a layer of cadmium yellow on top and just dotted away, and that gave the idea of the lighter tips, the lighter green tips on dark moss around this branch. And having never done it before, I am relatively happy with how successful it was. I think where the branch is here, I would want it a little bit more pale and more pale yellow on top of the grey. So I think that would make me a little bit more happy. But otherwise, I'm okay with what has happened here. And so, I'd like to thank you for joining me again to witness my studio practice. And thank you for viewing. I hope you'll join me for the next one. And I'm going to stop streaming now. Thank you and bye-bye.